It took 40 hours, 0 watts of electricity, and one dead walnut tree. What this man built using only the tools available to someone 300 years ago shouldn't be possible. Walk into any hardware store today and you'll find an entire wall of shortcuts. Power saws that slice through timber like butter. Nail guns that frame a wall in minutes. Laser-guided measuring tools that do the thinking for you. There's a plug-in solution for every problem. And honestly, most of them work beautifully. But there's a man on YouTube who looked at that entire wall and walked right past it. His name is Chris. He runs a channel called Chop with Chris. And on that channel, he builds things. Real, functional, sometimes jaw-dropping things without plugging in a single cord. No table saw, no electric sander, no drill press. Just axes, hand chisels, hammers, and a level of patience most of us can't even imagine. He's built coffee tables with hand-planed surfaces, rocking chairs joined without a single screw, bows and arrows carved from raw timber. Every project, start to finish, powered by nothing but muscle, knowledge, and an almost stubborn devotion to doing things the way they were done centuries ago. But recently, Chris attempted something different, something bigger, something that would push even his skills to the edge. He found a fallen walnut tree stump, waterlogged, rough, forgotten in the dirt, and he decided to turn it into a machine. 40 hours, no electricity, one man and a dead tree. What came out the other side? You'll have to stay with me to find out. It started the way most of Chris's projects start, with violence. He stood over the walnut stump, axe in hand, and studied the grain. This is something a power tool doesn't ask you to do. A bandsaw doesn't care about grain direction, it cuts wherever you tell it to. But when your only option is a wedge and a hammer, you need to read the wood. You need to understand where it wants to break and where it'll fight you. Chris carved his own wedges by hand, small, tapered pieces of hardwood designed to focus pressure along a single fracture line. He struck an axe blow into the face of the stump, opening a shallow crack, and then seated the wedges into that wound. Then he swung. Each strike sent the crack a little deeper. The wood groaned, fibers tore apart in slow motion, and after dozens of hits, the stump gave up its resistance and split, not into 2 pieces, but 3 long, rough beams of solid walnut. Chris picked up one of those beams and got to work. With a hand axe and a draw knife, he began to shape it, chopping away bark, shaving down ridges, roughing out a long, curved profile. He wasn't chasing perfection yet. At this stage, he was just having a conversation with the wood, asking it what shape it was willing to become. What emerged was a long, gently tapered beam, thick and sturdy at one end, thinner and slightly curved at the other. He repeated the process on a second beam until he had 2 nearly identical pieces. Then he carried them inside. Indoors, Chris switched to finer tools. A hand file kissed the surface of each beam, pulling up splinters and smoothing the grain until both pieces were clean to the touch. He carved a shallow channel along the top face of each, a subtle indentation that wouldn't make sense to most people watching. Not yet, anyway. He set the 2 beams aside. They were only the beginning. Here's where things got interesting. Chris disappeared into the brush behind his property and came back dragging a short, half-rotted log, the kind of wood most people would toss on a burn pile without a second thought. But Chris didn't see garbage. He saw a component. Using a hand drill, a literal hand-cranked auger, he bored a hole straight through the center of the rotted log, end to end. Then, with a handsaw, he cut a shallow groove into one face of the log, careful not to go all the way through. A chisel opened up the cut face, leaving a raised lip of wood, like a donut, circling the drilled hole. Then Chris walked over to a rust bin. He rummaged through a pile of forgotten metal, old brackets, bent nails, corroded hardware, until he found what he was looking for, a length of old pipe. Maybe a piece of a retired exhaust system, dented and discolored, but structurally sound. He fitted the pipe into the bottom of a battered tin wash basin, creating a sealed port. Then he connected the other end of the pipe to the hole in the rotted log. What Chris had just built, out of a decomposing stump, a piece of scrap pipe, and a basin he probably pulled from a junkyard, was a wood steamer. an honest-to-God steam-bending apparatus assembled without a single manufactured part. He filled a cast-iron cauldron with water, set the wash basin inside it, and lit a fire underneath. As the water boiled, steam climbed through the pipe, traveled through the rotted log, and poured into a larger stump he'd hollowed out and connected to the system using that donut lip as a perfect friction joint. The chamber filled with hot, pressurizing steam, and now, finally, it was time to bend wood. Chris slid those 2 walnut beams, the ones he'd spent hours carving and smoothing, into the steam-filled chamber and sealed it shut. Then he waited. This is the part no one talks about when they romanticize handcraft: the waiting. Steam needs time to penetrate wood fibers, to soften the cellulose and lignin that make timber rigid. There are no shortcuts here, no way to rush the chemistry. You just stand by the fire and trust the process. When the beams had soaked long enough, Chris pulled them from the chamber, pliable now, almost alive in their flexibility, and moved fast. Steam-bent wood doesn't stay cooperative for long. As it cools, it locks into whatever shape it's holding. Using leverage, wooden pegs, and a bending form, Chris curled the lip of each beam upward into a smooth, elegant curve. The thick end stayed flat. The thin end rose like the front of a... well, let's not spoil it just yet. He locked the bends in place and set the beams aside to dry and harden into their new shape. Then he did the whole thing again with 2 smaller beams, bending them into tighter curves. 4 beams, 4 bends, all from a single dead tree and a steamer made of garbage. Now came the joinery, and this is where Chris's skill shifted from impressive to almost unbelievable. Using a hand tool he'd carved himself, a narrow, chisel-like blade seated in a wooden handle, Chris began cutting uniform slots into the body of the larger beams. Each slot was measured, marked, and chiseled with surgical precision. These weren't rough gouges, they were mortises, clean, rectangular channels designed to receive a matching tenon. The smaller beams he'd bent earlier had been carved with corresponding tabs, digits that slid into those slots like a key into a lock. Chris fitted them in, tapped them tight, and suddenly the shape emerged. 2 long runners, cross beams connecting them, a frame rising from the back. He drilled holes through every joint by hand and threaded thin, flexible strips of wood through each one, natural dowels binding the skeleton together from the inside. No glue, no screws, no nails. Just wood holding wood, the way it's been done for thousands of years. Then Chris carved a series of thinner, flatter beams and began laying them across the frame. A platform, a floor, a deck. And instead of nailing them down, he soaked plant fibers in water until they were soft and pliable, then lashed every single floorboard to the frame with tight, deliberate wraps. As the fibers dried, they shrank, pulling the lashings tighter than any nail could hold. Finally, he fashioned 2 last pieces, long, crossed beams that formed an X-shaped brace at the rear of the structure. He tied them into place with the same soaked fibers and stepped back. 40 hours of work, 1 fallen tree, 0 watts of electricity, and standing in front of him was a dog sled. A full-sized, fully functional, handcrafted dog sled. The runners curved upward at the front in a graceful, sweeping arc. The crossbeams held rigid without a single metal fastener. The lashed floorboards flexed just enough to absorb shock, but held firm under weight. The whole structure was so light Chris picked it up with one hand and carried it outside like it was made of air. He set it down on the snow-packed ground behind his home. And then came the final piece of the puzzle: his dog. Chris harnessed up the family dog, clipped the leads to the front of the sled, and gave the word. And the sled moved. Not as a prop, not as a display piece. It cut through the snow the way a sled is supposed to, smooth, fast, and steady. The runners tracked straight. The frame held. The lashings didn't budge. A rotting walnut stump, a pile of rust, 40 hours of patience, and a machine that worked exactly the way it was designed to, centuries before anyone ever dreamed of plugging something into a wall. Here's the thing about Chris that sticks with you long after the video ends. It's not the sled. The sled is incredible, yes, but it's not the point. The point is that Chris looked at a dead tree and saw possibility. He looked at a rotting log and saw a steam chamber. He looked at a rusted pipe and saw a connection. Every piece of so-called junk in his hands became a tool, and every tool became a step towards something no algorithm or assembly line could replicate.
We live in an age of extraordinary convenience, and that convenience is genuinely wonderful, no one's arguing otherwise. But somewhere along the way, we stopped believing we could build things with just our hands. We outsourced our capability to cordless drills and laser cutters, and we forgot that for the vast majority of human history, people built civilizations with nothing more than what Chris used in that backyard: an axe, a chisel, a hammer, and time. Chris didn't build a dog sled to prove power tools are bad. He built it to prove that you don't need them, that skill, patience, and an understanding of raw materials can still produce something extraordinary, something that not only looks beautiful, but actually works. And maybe that's the lesson worth carrying out of this story. You are more capable than you think. The knowledge is ancient. The materials are all around you. And the only tool you truly can't do without is the willingness to start. And if you want to see what happens when someone applies this exact same patience to building an entire log cabin by hand, click the video on screen right now. I'll see you there.